Imagine a giant storm has just passed. The house is messy, the roof is leaking, and everyone is exhausted. That was the world in 1935. World War II had destroyed cities across Europe and Asia. The old leaders of the neighborhood, Britain and France, were too broke and tired to run things anymore. This left a massive power vacuum, an empty space that needed filling. Stepping into that space were the only two houses left standing strong, the United States and the Soviet Union. But instead of working together to rebuild the neighborhood, they started eyeing each other with deep suspicion. The problem wasn't just that the US and USSR were powerful, it's that they were running completely different operating systems. Think of it like Mac versus PC, but with nuclear weapons. The US pushed for capitalism and democracy, where individuals own businesses and vote for leaders. The USSR ran on communism and totalitarianism, where the state owns everything and one party makes all the decisions. Both sides truly believed their way was the only way to save humanity, and that the other side was an existential threat. You've heard the phrase drawing a line in the sand. Well, in 1946, Winston Churchill described a line drawn in iron. He famously said an iron curtain had descended across Europe. It wasn't a literal metal sheet, but a political barrier. To the west, you had democratic nations. To the east, Soviet-controlled satellite states. President Truman decided the US couldn't just sit back. He introduced containment. The idea wasn't to invade Russia, but to act like a dam, stopping the flood of communism from leaking into any new countries. Wars aren't always fought with bullets. Sometimes they're fought with wallets. After the war, Europe was starving and in ruins. Perfect conditions for communism to look appealing to desperate people. So the US launched the Marshall Plan. Imagine a rich uncle coming in and paying off all your debts and fixing your roof, free of charge. We sent over $13 billion to Western Europe. It worked. By making those countries rich and stable, they had no interest in becoming communist. If the Cold War was a chessboard, Berlin was the king. Even though Berlin was deep inside Soviet territory, half of the city belonged to the West. Stalin hated this. He tried to starve West Berlin out by blocking all roads. Instead of giving up, the Allies flew airplanes over the blockade, landing every few minutes for a year to drop food and coal. Later, in 1961, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall. It became the ultimate symbol of oppression, a concrete wall specifically designed to keep their own people from escaping to freedom. Have you ever seen kids on a playground form teams for protection? If you hit me, my big brother will hit you. That's exactly what happened here. The West formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a military alliance where an attack on one member was an attack on all. In response, the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact with their Eastern European neighbors. Now, Europe was officially divided into two massive armed camps staring each other down. In 1949, the US got a massive shock. For years, they supported the nationalists in China, but the communist forces led by Mao Zedong won the Civil War. Suddenly, the most populous country on earth was communist. This terrified American leaders. They started believing in the domino theory, the idea that if one country in Asia fell to communism, the next one would fall, and then the next, just like a row of dominoes. That domino theory was put to the test almost immediately in Korea. In 1950, communist North Korea invaded democratic South Korea. It was the first time the Cold War turned hot. The US and the UN rushed in to save the South, while China and the USSR backed the North. After 3 years of brutal fighting, they ended up almost exactly where they started, at the 38th parallel. Technically, the war never ended. They just signed a ceasefire. That's why the DNZ is still the most heavily militarized border in the world today. While soldiers were fighting on the ground, scientists were fighting in the labs. Both sides were stockpiling thousands of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the world 50 times over. We called this MAD, or mutually assured destruction. It was a grim logic. I won't nuke you because you'll nuke me back, and we'll both die. This competition extended to the stars. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite, Americans panicked. It meant if they could put a ball in space, they could drop a bomb on New York. This kicked off the race to the moon. Now, while the giants were wrestling, the rest of the world was waking up. The old empires of Britain and France were crumbling. The jewel in the British crown was India. Led by Mahatma Gandhi, who used non-violent protest and civil disobedience, India demanded freedom. But independence came with a heavy price. The British partitioned the land into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. It was like taking a single house and building a wall through the living room. Millions were displaced, and violence erupted, creating scars that still haven't healed. The winds of change blew through Africa next. For nearly a century, European powers had carved up the continent like a cake, ignoring tribal boundaries. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan nation to gain independence, followed by a wave of others. But leaving wasn't easy. The Europeans left behind arbitrary borders that grouped rival ethnic groups together, setting the stage for civil wars and dictatorships that the US and USSR would later exploit for their own gain. Not everyone wanted to pick a side in the schoolyard fight between the US and Russia. Leaders from newly independent countries in Asia and Africa met in Bandung in 1955. They called themselves the Non-Aligned Movement. They effectively said, "We are the third world," not meaning poor, but meaning the third option. They wanted to focus on their own development rather than being pawns in the superpowers chess game. The Cold War hit close to home for the US, literally 90 miles off the coast of Florida, in Cuba. Fidel Castro took over and aligned with the Soviets. In 1962, US spy planes saw Soviet nuclear missiles being built in Cuba. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 terrifying days, the world held its breath. It was a staring contest between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev. Thankfully, the Soviets blinked first and removed the missiles, but it was the closest we ever came to pressing the red button. Vietnam became the war that defined a generation. It was the domino theory in action. The US believed they had to stop North Vietnam from making the South communist. But they were fighting a guerrilla war in thick jungles against an enemy fighting for their own home. It dragged on for nearly 20 years. It tore America apart socially, with massive protests at home. Eventually, the US withdrew, and Vietnam was united under communism. It proved that even a superpower couldn't force its will on a determined population. Another hotspot flared up in the Middle East. After the horrors of the Holocaust, the UN established Israel in 1948 as a homeland for Jewish people. But this land was already inhabited by Palestinians. The surrounding Arab nations immediately declared war. This regional conflict got sucked into the Cold War vacuum. The US became Israel's main supplier, while the Soviets armed the Arab states. It turned the Middle East into a powder keg that is still exploding today. By the 1970s, both the US and USSR were exhausted. They had thousands of nukes and were spending too much money. They entered a period called détente, a French word for relaxation. President Nixon even visited China, exploiting a rift between the Chinese and Soviets. They signed treaties like SALT to limit the number of missiles. It wasn't friendship, but it was a lowering of the temperature, like agreeing to stop shouting and just talk quietly for a while. In South Africa, a unique struggle was happening. The white minority government enforced apartheid, strict, brutal segregation. For decades, The US was awkward about this. They didn't like apartheid, but the South African government was anti-communist, so the US kept them as allies. But the people, led by the African National Congress and figures like Nelson Mandela, fought back. The fall of the Cold War actually helped end apartheid, because the West no longer needed South Africa as a bulwark against communism. In 1979, the Soviet Union made a fatal mistake. They invaded Afghanistan to prop up a communist government. It became their version of Vietnam, a long, unwinnable war against fierce guerrilla fighters called the Mujahideen. Interestingly, the US supplied these fighters with Stinger missiles. The war drained the Soviet economy and destroyed the morale of their army, contributing heavily to the empire's collapse. In the 1980s, a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, realized the USSR was broke and broken. He tried to fix it with glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. But giving people a little bit of freedom is dangerous for a dictatorship. Once the pressure valve was opened, the whole tank exploded. In 1989, the people of Berlin tore down the wall. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. So where does that leave us? The Cold War shaped the modern world map. It left the US as the sole superpower for a time. It created independent nations across Africa and Asia, though many are still struggling with the borders drawn by Europeans and the weapons left by superpowers. Today, we see new tensions rising that look suspiciously like the old ones, between the West, Russia, and a rising China. Studying the Cold War isn't just history. It's the user manual for understanding today's headlines.